Back in my sorority days, I often served as one of the sober sisters for events. The task was pretty simple: keep an eye out for sisters that had to be cut off, dudes being creepy, and anyone trying to leave the venue. Sometimes it involved passing flip-flops to whoever thought stilettos were danceable, or a plastic bag to those who looked a little green around the gills on the bus ride home. We had a few sober sisters at each event, including the president, vice president of social standards, volunteers, and usually anyone that required close monitoring at the previous event. Sort of a take a penny, leave a penny situation. But sober sisters knew what they were agreeing to when they stepped aboard the bus: a night of babysitting. For people who joined the military and serve as military police, the potential for doing good work is infinite. But sometimes they act as a sober sis, a babysitter for drunk people, and get punched in the nose for it. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. I selected this case because I was in Okinawa and I remember when it happened. It was an incident that occurred right in the middle of the Marine Corps ball season, which had just returned following a 1-year COVID absence. The 2020 ball cancellation resulted in a lot of steaks given away at the chow hall and endless efforts to sell surplus ball gifts, a blanket if my memory serves. Newly vaxxed ball attendees had their first social event in approximately 18 months. And, well, the Marine Corps was formed in a colonial tavern, and they're uniquely talented in keeping that spirit alive. I'll note that I did try to find news coverage that I distinctly remember reading, but it turns out this is a fairly common fact pattern. Lance Corporal Robert Tarin III lived and worked aboard Camp Hansen in the northern half of Okinawa's main island, up near a series of well-known ichigo or strawberry farms. Tarin worked as a planning specialist with the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force Information Group. While there are descriptions available for what a planning specialist does, I'm going to level with you. It boils down to planning. And that might sound stupid, but the description offered by the military reduces to the same darn thing, listing duties such as updating a plan and coordinating execution of said plan, which is just planning. I have no doubt that someone who worked in the role can offer a much better description, but I feel like I'm trying to define the color blue with what I've got to work with. Camp Hansen is jam-packed with young, unmarried Marines. There is no family housing on the base, and given the 9-to-1 ratio of men to women in the Marine Corps, it feels like a better disciplined fraternity. The area around the base is stacked with tattoo parlors, which are still largely considered taboo in Japan, so their customer base is quite clear. On the evening of November 7th, 2021, Tarin indulged in that better disciplined fraternity atmosphere, and after what I presume was a series of alcoholic drinks, became heavily intoxicated. However, it's genuinely less about the volume of alcohol he consumed and more about the decisions that he made after consuming the alcohol. While walking back to his barracks room in his drunken state, Tarin decided he was going to borrow a fellow Devil Dog's car. If I was pressed to venture a guess, I would assume he was headed to a Lawson's or Family Mart in search of drunk snacks. The thing is, though, that he didn't seek permission for taking the vehicle. Had he done so, it's a pretty safe bet that his fellow Marine would have said no. Tarin was too drunk to drive under an American blood alcohol content limit, but he was certainly too drunk to drive under the much lower Japanese BAC limit. Nevertheless, Tarin acquired the keys, pulled out of the parking spot, and set off. Shortly thereafter, he crashed her car into a ditch. The bases in Okinawa are replete with ditches to catch storm water runoff and direct it elsewhere. When hurricanes, known locally as typhoons, crash through for 6 months out of the year, they bring torrents of rain, and it has to go somewhere. The ditches are deep, and when full of water rushing to be directed elsewhere, they're dangerous. During our time on the rock, one young man lost his life after falling into surging storm water, being pinned against a grate and drowning. After Tarin crashed that car that didn't belong to him, several MPs or military police arrived. They watched as Tarin ran away from the single-car accident, running into a group of trees near the fence line. Running into the trees in the dark in Okinawa is not something I would advise, especially if you are not a fan of face-sized spiders and venomous pit vipers. But Tarin was lucky and didn't run into anything that goes bump in the night. He remained lucky, I suppose, when he made it away from the MPs and over the fence, I guess missing the triple stack of barbed wire crowning the exterior fence line. But when he was out in town, his luck shifted. He was off base and didn't speak the local language, didn't really have local friends, and most businesses catering to Americans were closed for the evening, whether due to shortened business hours due to COVID or because it was just that late in the evening. Needing a place to go, Tarin broke into the home of a local family, physically assaulting one of them before passing out on their floor. The family summoned local police, who carried Tarin out and placed him in the back of one of their police vehicles. Recognizing a drunk Marine when they saw one, the local police called the military police and encouraged them to come get their guy. When MPs arrived, they told Tarin they were going to transfer him into their vehicle. In response, Tarin mumbled something in gibberish before discussing someone the court describes as fictitious, named Elon. I think we can all agree, given recent headlines, there's at least one person named Elon who's not fictitious. But it seems unlikely that Tarin was discussing that guy. In a moment of clarity, Tarin sat up and informed the MPs that he was going to run. They told him that was a bad idea and advised him not to run away. They put their hands out to keep him corralled. Tarin rocked back and forth in the back seat and started a countdown. When he reached the end of his countdown, he swung his legs outside of the Japanese police car and wobbled to a stand. Surrounded by MPs with nowhere to go, Tarin took a swing at Corporal Smith, connecting with his nose. Then he turned to run, but was stopped, dropped to the ground, and cuffed. Witness reports differ on just what part of his body Tarin hit Corporal Smith with, whether it was a fist, an arm, or a headbutt. One witness said she didn't see anyone hit Corporal Smith. For his part, Tarin reported to investigators that he believed he hit Corporal Smith with his hand, though it's not clear if that was closed or open fist. Tarin pled guilty without the benefit of a plea agreement to drunken operation of a vehicle, wrongful appropriation of a vehicle, leaving the scene of a vehicular accident, unlawful entry, and assault consummated by battery. That left a single contested specification of assault consummated by battery. There's some strategy in pleading in this way, and perhaps Tarin decided it made more sense to limit the universe of facts before the panel and contest only one specification of assault consummated by battery, for hitting Corporal Smith. Without the DUI, car theft, hit and run, breaking and entering, and assaulting a local man at issue, the story of November 7th, 2021 was a young, drunk man sitting in the back of a Japanese police cruiser counting down to his escape and hitting an MP in the nose with some part of his body. Tarin's defense filed a motion for a finding of not guilty under Rule for Courts Martial 917, arguing the government failed to prove Tarin's intent to commit bodily harm or that he acted with culpable negligence. Consistent with the rest of their defense, they contended Tarin accidentally struck Corporal Smith as he was standing and exiting the police cruiser. They lost that motion, and the panel later found him guilty of that final offense. The court-martial judge sentenced Tarin to 5 months of confinement, reduction from E3 to E1, and forfeiture of $1,278 per month for 3 months. While his appeal wound its way through the military justice system, Tarin started college courses. Simple assault and minor property damage are, of course, inexcusable, and separately embarrassing in a host nation. But I am glad to see that his conviction has not held him back in pursuing something different. On appeal, Tarin alleged a single error at his court-martial, that there was a major change to the contested charge, causing a fatal variance. I chose this case because I remembered the incident, and remembered wondering if we'd all be punished for Tarin's drunken escapades, but I enjoyed this case because I got to learn some new things. A variance governed by RCM 918A1 occurs when the evidence at trial establishes the commission of a criminal offense, but that evidence, that proof, does not conform strictly with the offense alleged in the charge. And that can happen in a variety of contexts. If, for instance, there's a substantial mismatch between the offense charged and the offense proven, that variance is fatal. Like if someone was charged with solicitation to commit murder, but the evidence only proved solicitation to obstruct justice. We'll cover that case in another time. Similarly, substantial differences in the date listed in a charge and the date proven at trial can be, but are not necessarily fatal. Given the differences in witness testimony about how Corporal Smith came to be bopped in the nose, the government had a bit of a dilemma. In the charge, they'd described Tarin hitting Corporal Smith with his hand, and that Tarin knew Corporal Smith was executing his duties as military law enforcement. The court-martial judge gave what's described as the standard instruction regarding exceptions and substitutions, and the panel was pretty careful in what they found Tarin guilty of. They found Tarin guilty of assault consummated by battery. They crossed out the part about it being committed with his hand, and that Tarin knew Corporal Smith was executing his duties as an MP. I imagine, as government counsel, getting a red-line copy of the verdict form is a slightly bewildering experience. The Navy and Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals had to decide whether what the panel found Tarin guilty of was a fatal variance. The case law has made clear that exceptions cannot be used to substantially change the nature of the offense or to increase the seriousness of the offense. On appeal, it was Tarin's job to demonstrate that the variance, the issue of what he used to hit Corporal Smith, was both material and prejudicial. A variance is prejudicial when it puts an accused at risk of another prosecution for the same conduct, affects an accused's ability to prepare for trial, or denies an accused the ability to defend against the charge. In one variance case, for example, an accused was charged with missing a specific flight that he was supposed to be on as part of his unit's movement. At court-martial, no one could remember the flight number the accused missed. The variance was material because missing unit movement was an integral element of the offense, but the courts of appeal ultimately determined that the accused wasn't prejudiced by a verdict that found him guilty of missing unit movement except for that specific flight number. They came to that conclusion because the defense, that he'd been kidnapped, wouldn't have changed based on the flight number for the plane he failed to climb aboard. In Tarin's case, the NMCCA concluded that the assault consummated by battery boiled down to whether or not Tarin caused bodily harm to Corporal Smith. The evidence presented at the court-martial demonstrated that Tarin did unlawfully bodily harm Corporal Smith using force or violence. Whether he did that with his hand, his forearm, his elbow, or his head didn't particularly matter, because he still struck Corporal Smith. Although Tarin's appeal failed on the first factor, the NMCCA still played out the thought experiment and considered if the variance was somehow material, whether Tarin suffered any prejudice. It might have been a protective move, so that if the Court of Appeal for the Armed Forces, CAF, disagreed with whether the variance was material, they might still have grounds to uphold the NMCCA's decision. Tarin argued that he wasn't able to adequately prepare for trial, that the variance changed the nature of the offense, and that he was denied the opportunity to mount a proper defense on the charge. But defense counsel and Tarin always knew there were a slew of witnesses who had different vantage points for his misconduct, and offered different descriptions of his actions. More importantly, the only discernible difference between the various accounts was just which part of Tarin's body hit Corporal Smith's nose. Tarin's defense was always that he was not culpable for the harm because any contact between Tarin and Corporal Smith's nose was accidental. His defense wasn't actually based on which part of his body made harmful contact. That defense was comparable to the case where the accused missed unit movement, which plane he missed didn't inform his kidnapping defense. With that in mind, the NMCCA dismissed the idea that Tarin wasn't able to somehow prepare or focus his defense. They then looked at whether the exceptions the panel added opened Tarin up for fresh new prosecutions, and ultimately they concluded that the exceptions did not. That gave NMCCA extra ammunition to affirm the findings and sentence of the court-martial. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we get down to brass tacks about parental discipline. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.